Being too kind is the fastest way to make people disrespect you. Sounds harsh? It's the truth. The more you give, the less people value you. The more you tolerate, the less they respect you. Kindness without limits isn't virtue. It's self-sabotage. And the Stoics knew this long before modern psychology caught up. If you think being nice will earn you respect, you've been lied to. Let me show you why. 1. Overkindness looks like weakness. Let's dive deep into a harsh truth. Excessive kindness is not a badge of honor. It's a glaring sign of weakness. In a world that values strength, decisiveness, and boundaries, constantly bending over backward for everyone is a recipe for being taken advantage of. And frankly, it makes you look vulnerable. I learned this lesson the hard way. There was a period in my life when I believed that if I was endlessly kind, warm, and accommodating, people would naturally see me as a caring, indispensable friend or colleague. I was the person who always said yes, even when my schedule was overflowing. The one who never hesitated to lend a hand or an ear, even if it meant sacrificing my own needs. I thought that by showing unconditional kindness, I was elevating myself morally and earning respect in return. But reality proved to be brutally different. One incident in particular still haunts me. I remember covering an extra shift for a coworker who was swamped. Thinking I was doing a noble thing, I did it with genuine goodwill, expecting that when my own time of need came, someone would reciprocate. Instead, when I later asked for support on a major project, I was met with excuses and indifference. That moment was a turning point. I realized that my constant generosity had painted me as nothing more than a doormat, a free resource for everyone around me. This experience wasn't isolated. Reflect on that person in your life who always prioritizes others over themselves. Over time, people begin to see them not as a friend or a colleague, but as an open door for their own convenience. The more you give without expecting anything in return, the more you teach others that your kindness is an unlimited supply. Rather than a thoughtful, selective act of goodwill, I've seen it again and again in social circles, in workplaces, even in families. The overkind person often becomes the go-to for favors, the one whose time and energy are seen as dispensable. And the consequence? They become increasingly invisible when it comes to their own needs. Friends, acquaintances, and even strangers start to take that kindness for granted. They assume that because you're always willing to help, you're not worth the effort of reciprocation. Or worse, an easy target for exploitation. Marcus Aurelius once said, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." If you constantly allow yourself to be treated as a pushover, you're essentially choosing to be colored with the hue of weakness. This is not a flattering shade in any society. In a world that rewards strength and decisiveness, overkindness can be misinterpreted as a lack of backbone. It sends a clear message: I am available, and my time is free for the taking. I remember the sinking feeling when I realized that my kindness was being used as a free pass for others to avoid taking responsibility for themselves. My friends and colleagues began to expect my help as a given, rather than as an act of generosity. I was the person they'd turn to when they didn't want to do the hard work. And ironically, the very act of helping me became rare and undervalued. It was as if my kindness had become background noise in the cacophony of everyday life. A noise that no one bothered to listen to because it was always there. Here's the controversial twist. Kindness without boundaries is not a moral high ground. It's a strategic error. It is one thing to be kind. It is another to let that kindness morph into a pattern that invites disrespect. When you never say no or never stand up for your own needs, you essentially signal that your well-being is secondary. And in any relationship, personal, professional, or social, this imbalance can lead to exploitation and resentment. The lesson is clear. Kindness must be balanced with self-respect and firm boundaries. It's not about turning into a hardened cynic or abandoning your compassionate nature. It's about recognizing that by saying yes to everything, you're indirectly giving others permission to disregard your own needs. Respect is not something that is freely given to someone who is a perpetual pushover. It's earned by standing up for yourself. If you find yourself constantly drained by the demands of others, it might be time to reassess your approach. Ask yourself, am I being kind? Or am I simply being available? Learn to say no without guilt. Understand that every time you allow your kindness to be exploited, you're not just sacrificing your time, you're sacrificing your dignity. And no one, including yourself, should ever settle for being treated as if their contributions are free. 2. People exploit what they don't fear. Let's get straight to the point. If you don't make others fear losing you, they'll exploit you without a second thought. It's a brutal truth, but one we need to face. When you're so endlessly kind and accommodating that you never push back, you signal to the world that your time, energy, and emotions are free commodities, an open invitation for exploitation. I learned this lesson in the most painful way possible. Early in my career, I prided myself on being the nice guy, always ready to lend a hand, always ready to listen. I believed that my kindness would naturally earn me loyalty and respect. But reality had a different lesson in store. I had a coworker who quickly noticed my unwavering willingness to help. Whenever he was overloaded, he would effortlessly offload his work on me, confident that I wouldn't object. I thought I was being a team player. But in truth, I was being used. My constant yes became his excuse to avoid accountability. And I was left feeling drained and unappreciated. This isn't just about one workplace or one individual. It's a pattern we see everywhere. In friendships, for example, when you're the person who always sacrifices your own plans or needs for someone else's convenience, people start to assume that you're an endless resource. They come to expect that your kindness is just part of who you are, rather than a valuable gift that deserves respect. And when you never put up any resistance, you give them permission to take advantage of you, time and time again. Here's the controversial twist. Kindness without boundaries is not noble. It's a weakness. Society tells us that being kind is a moral imperative. But what they don't warn you about is the toxic flip side. If you never assert your needs, if you always let others dictate the terms of your interactions, you become an easy target. People will continue to push your limits if you don't set clear boundaries. They'll test you, and when you don't fight back, they'll push even further. Think about it. Who respects someone who's always too available? Not the person who fears losing their chance to take advantage. True respect isn't given to a pushover. It's earned by showing that you have limits and that your well-being matters as much as anyone else's. I had to learn that lesson the hard way. I finally started saying no when I was overwhelmed, even if it meant disappointing someone in the short term. And yes, it was controversial. Some called me selfish or uncooperative. But over time, I noticed a dramatic shift. People began to value my time and respect my decisions because I made it clear that I wasn't an endless reservoir of favors. This personal experience was a wake-up call. It forced me to reconsider what it means to be kind. Kindness is not a free pass for others to step all over you. It must be wielded with a sense of self-worth and a readiness to defend your boundaries. The harsh reality is, if you don't make others fear the loss of your goodwill, they will exploit it without hesitation. So ask yourself, are you being kind? Or are you just making yourself vulnerable? In every relationship, whether at work, with friends, or within your family, you deserve to be valued, not taken for granted. People exploit what they don't fear. If you let your kindness go unchecked, you risk becoming a magnet for those who see you as a soft target. Instead, balance your generosity with the strength to say, no. That's not being unkind. It's being smart enough to ensure that your kindness is respected, not exploited. 3. Kindness without boundaries attracts the wrong people. Here's a truth that might ruffle some feathers. When you extend kindness without limits, you inadvertently become a magnet for those who only see your generosity as an opportunity to exploit you. It's a controversial notion because society often praises unbridled kindness without warning that it can also invite the wrong crowd. I learned this lesson the hard way. There was a time when I prided myself on being the ever-helpful friend. The person who never said, no. No matter how inconvenient or exhausting the request. I believed that my open-hearted nature was my greatest strength, a reflection of my integrity and compassion. However, reality hit hard when I started noticing a pattern. The same people who benefited from my kindness were not the ones who stood by me when I needed help. For instance, I vividly recall a period when a group of acquaintances would regularly call on me for favors, ranging from last-minute errands to lending money, without ever offering to reciprocate or even a simple, thank you. I felt good about helping them, believing that my actions would eventually build a network of mutual support. Instead, I found myself increasingly isolated when I reached out during a crisis. Those same individuals were nowhere to be found. It was as if my kindness had been misinterpreted as an open invitation for them to take advantage of me, rather than a sign of genuine friendship. The controversial twist here is that kindness without boundaries is not pure or noble. It's a red flag to opportunists. In our culture, we are often encouraged to be selfless, to put others first. But what isn't said is that this can create an imbalance where you become more of a doormat than a respected individual. People who lack their own sense of responsibility might see your boundless kindness as a chance to avoid accountability. They learn that if you're always willing to help, you're unlikely to confront them or enforce any sort of reciprocal relationship. I experienced this firsthand in my professional life as well. Early on, I volunteered for every extra project, every late meeting, and every piece of additional work, without ever asking for recognition or a fair share of the rewards. I thought I was demonstrating leadership and teamwork. Instead, I soon noticed that my contributions were taken for granted. My ideas were credited to others, and my extra effort was expected as the norm rather than celebrated as an exception. My unguarded kindness made it easy for people to exploit my dedication, leaving me feeling both undervalued and burned out. The lesson is clear. If you let your kindness flow without any boundaries, you risk attracting those who see your generosity as a weakness to be exploited. It's not about shutting yourself off or becoming cynical. It's about recognizing that genuine, balanced kindness requires clear limits. When you learn to set boundaries, you start filtering out the opportunists and invite relationships that are truly reciprocal and respectful. So next time you're tempted to help without considering your own needs, pause and ask yourself, am I being kind? Or am I just handing out a free pass to those who might not deserve it? True strength lies in pairing compassion with discernment. Remember, your kindness is valuable. It deserves to be shared with those who genuinely appreciate and reciprocate it, not with those who only see an opportunity. 4. People assume you need their approval. Let's be blunt. If you're always fishing for approval through endless kindness, you're sending a signal that you depend on others for validation. And that's a magnet for manipulation. It's a controversial stance because we've been conditioned to think that seeking approval is natural and even necessary. But here's the kicker. When you constantly crave others' validation, you inadvertently hand them the power to dictate your self-worth. I remember a time when I was desperately seeking acceptance. I'd go out of my way to help everyone, always ready with a smile and a kind word, believing that if I was nice enough, people would naturally admire me. I even adjusted my opinions and suppressed my own needs just to avoid rocking the boat. I thought that by pleasing everyone, I was securing my place in their good graces. But soon I realized that my behavior wasn't winning me genuine respect. It was painting me as someone who was overly dependent on others for approval. For instance, I once spent hours helping a friend plan a big event, meticulously arranging details, running errands, and handling last-minute crises, without ever expressing my own needs or setting any boundaries. Later, when I needed a simple favor, I was met with indifference and excuses. It became clear that my constant need to be liked had made me invisible when it mattered most. Instead of being seen as a confident, self-assured individual, I was pigeonholed as someone who needed constant validation. Here's the controversial truth. When you operate from a place of needing approval, people quickly realize you're not as self-reliant as you might appear. They see that your kindness is less about genuine generosity and more about securing their praise and acceptance. And when you give that away freely, it diminishes your own value. No one wants to be around someone who seems to be perpetually seeking permission or trying to earn a favor with every kind act. Instead, people gravitate toward those who have solid boundaries, who are unapologetically themselves, and who don't need external validation to feel complete. This dependency on approval doesn't just affect personal relationships, it seeps into professional life as well. Early in my career, I was the first to volunteer for extra projects, the first to agree with everyone in meetings, and the last to speak up when something was off. I was so focused on gaining positive feedback that I ended up stifling my own creativity and worth. My colleagues began to view my constant compliance as a lack of backbone, rather than as a collaborative spirit. They figured that if I was always chasing their approval, I would never dare to challenge the status quo, even when it was necessary. The lesson here is both simple and controversial. You have to stop relying on others to define your worth. Your value isn't determined by how many people you please or how much validation you receive. When you seek approval in every interaction, you're essentially telling others, I'm not enough on my own. And that is a message no one should ever have to send. To break this cycle, start by trusting your own judgment and setting clear boundaries. Embrace the idea that it's perfectly okay, actually. It's essential to say no sometimes. This isn't about being confrontational. It's about cultivating a sense of self-respect that doesn't hinge on external validation. When you learn to be confident in your own skin, people will naturally respond with respect, not out of obligation, but because they recognize your authentic strength. So the next time you find yourself bending over backward for someone, ask, am I doing this because I genuinely care? Or because I'm desperate for approval? Your kindness should be a reflection of your values, not a plea for acceptance. In the end, when you stop chasing others' validation, you start earning the kind of respect that comes from being truly self-assured. And that's something no one can ever take away from you. 5. Being too available lowers your worth. Let's cut through the niceties. If you're always available, you're signaling that your time and energy are worthless. It's a harsh truth, but one that challenges our ingrained belief that constant accessibility makes us more likable or trustworthy. In reality, the more you put yourself at everyone's disposal, the more you diminish your own value. And that's something no one truly deserves. I learned this lesson through a series of personal missteps and hard-earned experiences. Early in my career, I prided myself on being the go-to person, the one who was always ready to help, always answering calls, and always available at a moment's notice. I believed that being perpetually accessible would endear me to my colleagues and friends, making me indispensable. But as time passed, I noticed a disturbing trend. People began to assume that my help was not a privilege, but an entitlement. For instance, there was a period when I simply couldn't say no. My calendar was packed with back-to-back meetings, and I was constantly bombarded with requests for assistance, even for tasks that were trivial or irrelevant to my core responsibilities. I started feeling overwhelmed, stressed, and most importantly, taken for granted. My endless availability transformed into a default setting that others exploited without even a moment's hesitation. This isn't just a workplace issue. It's pervasive in every aspect of life. Think about the friend who always drops by unannounced, the colleague who expects you to be available on weekends, or the family member who leans on you emotionally day in and day out without ever considering your own needs. When you're always on call, you end up teaching everyone around you that your time is free, a commodity that ultimately erodes your self-worth. Here's the controversial part. Being too available doesn't make you kind. It makes you expendable. In our modern world, availability is often mistaken for reliability. But when it comes at the expense of your well-being, it's a double-edged sword. People start to see you as a constant resource rather than as a person with your own valuable life. Your time becomes something that is expected rather than earned. And when it's always free, it loses its intrinsic value. I vividly remember a period when my relentless availability led me straight into burnout. I was the person who answered every text immediately, replied to every email at all hours, and always said yes, even when I desperately needed a break. The constant demand on my time left me not only exhausted but also deeply resentful. I eventually realized that I was no longer seen as a partner or a friend, but as a convenient option for someone else's needs. It was a painful awakening. A moment of reckoning where I understood that scarcity creates value. When you're constantly available, you inadvertently lower your own worth in the eyes of others. It's like a restaurant that offers unlimited free meals. The value of each meal diminishes because it's so readily accessible. Similarly, if you never protect your time and always say, yes, people will begin to see your contributions as the norm rather than as an act of exceptional generosity. Absolutely. Here is the continuation of the text you provided. The antidote isn't about becoming distant or unkind. It's about setting clear boundaries and cultivating self-respect. Learn to say no when your plate is full. Reserve time for yourself, and recognize that your time is as valuable as anyone else's. By being selective about when and how you make yourself available, you not only protect your well-being but also signal to others that your time is worth respecting. 6. Healthy relationships demand equal investment. Let's stir the pot. If you're the only one investing in a relationship, you're not nurturing a partnership. You're running a charity. It might sound cold, but the truth is, healthy relationships require mutual give and take. When one person continually pours in effort without receiving the same level of commitment in return, you're not in a relationship. You're in a one-sided transaction where your value is being compromised. I learned this lesson through some hard personal experiences. For years, I was the friend who was always available, always willing to lend an ear, and always the first to help out. I believed that if I gave enough, the relationship would naturally balance itself out over time. Instead, I found myself constantly being the one who reached out, organized gatherings, and remembered birthdays, while the other person consistently showed up only when it was convenient for them. I started to feel like I was running a one-man operation, investing my time and energy into relationships that were essentially a bank of favors I never saw a return on. One particularly painful experience was with a close friend who I thought truly valued our bond. I invested countless hours listening to their problems, helping them navigate personal crises, and even stepping in during emergencies. However, when I was struggling or needed support, that same friend was nowhere to be found. The imbalance was stark, and it forced me to confront the uncomfortable reality. I was giving away my time and energy to someone who didn't value it nearly as much as I did. Here's the controversial twist. Not all relationships are meant to be given equal parts of you. Society romanticizes selflessness, suggesting that love and friendship are about sacrifice. But when that sacrifice becomes one-sided, it isn't love, it's martyrdom. Relationships should be like a balanced ledger. When you're always the one making deposits without any withdrawals, you eventually run out of resources, and resentment starts to build. Think about it this way. Would you expect a business to operate if only one party was contributing to its success? No. Both sides need to invest equally to reap mutual benefits. The same logic applies to personal relationships. When both parties invest, there's a balance that fosters trust, respect, and a genuine sense of partnership. Without that balance, you're not truly connecting. You're merely accommodating. I've come to realize that healthy relationships demand that both parties show up and invest equally. It's not about keeping score, but rather about creating a dynamic where both individuals feel valued and supported. This means sometimes having difficult conversations, setting boundaries, and being willing to walk away from relationships where the imbalance is too great. It might feel harsh at first, but over time, you'll attract relationships that are reciprocal and empowering. The deep, perhaps controversial message here is: you deserve relationships where your efforts are mirrored, not exploited. Your time, energy, and love are precious, and when you invest them in a relationship, you should expect and demand a similar level of commitment in return. Anything less isn't a relationship. It's an imbalance that slowly chips away at your self-worth. So ask yourself, am I in a relationship where I'm the only one putting in the work? Recognize that you have every right to expect equal investment. When both people are equally committed, the relationship transforms from a transactional exchange into a genuine partnership, one where both individuals grow, support each other, and truly flourish. If the scales are tipped too far in one direction, it might be time to re-evaluate if that relationship is worth the cost to your well-being. 7. Overcommitting leaves no room for self-growth. Let's face it, when you overcommit to everyone else, you effectively lock the door to your own personal evolution. It's a controversial truth that our society, with its constant praise for being selfless and available, often overlooks the fact that sacrificing your own time and energy for others can stunt your growth and leave you feeling hollow. I learned this lesson the hard way. For a long time, I was the person who said yes to every request. Whether it was volunteering for extra projects at work, helping a friend through every crisis, or taking on responsibilities that weren't even part of my role, I thought I was being dependable and supportive, believing that my endless availability was a virtue. However, what I didn't realize was that every time I agreed to help someone else, I was sacrificing a precious opportunity to invest in myself. I remember a period when I was juggling so many obligations that my own personal projects and passions fell by the wayside. I had dreams of learning new skills and even starting a side business that would allow me to express my creativity. Yet each time I blocked off time for myself, a colleague or friend would call for help, and my personal goals were pushed further down the priority list. Instead of growing, I was stuck in a cycle of meeting everyone else's needs while my own aspirations languished. The controversial twist here is that the very act of overcommitting, which many mistake for being kind or reliable, is actually a form of self-sabotage. Society tells us that being constantly available is a sign of strength. But in reality, it can be a silent killer of self-growth. Every time you neglect your own development in favor of assisting others, you're essentially saying that your dreams, ambitions, and personal well-being are less important. And over time, that message not only stifles your progress, it chips away at your self-worth. Think about it. Have you ever felt a nagging sense of regret after a day spent running errands for everyone but yourself? Or notice that while you're busy making time for others, your own goals and passions are gathering dust? That's the price of overcommitting. You may earn admiration or be seen as reliable, but at what cost? Your personal growth, your creativity, and even your mental and emotional health can suffer when you're always the one putting others first. I eventually learned to set boundaries and recognize that investing in my own growth was not selfish. It was essential. I started blocking off time for personal projects, learning, and self-care, and the difference was night and day. Not only did I begin to thrive professionally and creatively, but I also found that those around me started respecting my need for personal time. It was a wake-up call. True self-growth happens when you prioritize yourself, not when you become a perpetual caretaker for everyone else's needs. The deep, perhaps uncomfortable message here is that you are your most important project. While it's noble to help others, you must also recognize that your time is limited and your potential is boundless. But only if you allow yourself the space to grow. When you continuously overcommit, you shortchange yourself and miss out on opportunities to become the best version of who you are. So ask yourself, am I constantly sacrificing my own development for the sake of others? If the answer is yes, it might be time to re-evaluate your priorities. Embrace the idea that self-investment isn't selfish. It's a necessary act of self-respect. Balance your commitments, set clear boundaries, and remember that personal growth is the fuel that will empower you to be even more effective and compassionate when you do help others. After all, you can't pour from an empty cup. At the end of the day, kindness is a virtue, but only when it's paired with wisdom and self-respect. If you give too much without boundaries, people won't see you as noble. They'll see you as an easy target. The world doesn't reward endless generosity. It respects balance, confidence, and the ability to stand firm when necessary. So ask yourself, am I being kind? Or am I being taken for granted? True kindness isn't about bending over backward for people who don't appreciate it. It's about knowing when to give and when to walk away. Set boundaries, demand respect, and remember, the moment you stop overextending yourself is the moment people start valuing your presence. If this message resonated with you, don't just sit on it. Apply it. Because in a world that constantly demands your kindness, the real power lies in knowing when to say no.